Hi, so welcome to the Retribution Paladin 7.3 Companion Guide. This is designed to sit alongside my Essentials Guides, which don't need updating from when I last did them for 7.2, or at least 7.2.5, because the way we're going to play the game is basically the same. There are some changes coming. I'm going to, first of all, in this video, go through the patch notes and explain the consequences of that. Then I'm going to explore how we might use different pieces of gear or different talents. Are any dead talents, for example, going to be coming online for 7.3? So the first point to notice in the patch notes is they say, traits and legendaries that buff Crusade should still be attractive, but not as far ahead of the pack as they previously were. This is interesting. You didn't used to get things like this in the patch notes, where it's an explanatory note sort of giving you some guidance, and that's really good. And what is even better is it is also correct. So I'm going to go into a slightly different order here, because what are they talking about there? Basically, Crusade has effectively been nerfed because, as you can see on the third point down, Wrath of the Ashbringer trait bonus reduced to 2 seconds per rank was 2.5 seconds per rank. So these are the traits on our Ashbringer. Of course, if you've got a full Ashbringer, I'm going to assume you have at the moment, then you've already got at least 4. You may have up to another 3 based on your relics. So at the moment, these are extending Crusade by 2.5 seconds per trait. It's now going to be 2 seconds. So if you don't have any relics and you just have the 4 traits, you're losing 2 seconds of Crusade. If you have that and 1 relic, as I do, as I'd say it's the most common one, because Demonic Inquisition in Tomb of Sargeras drops a Wrath of the Ashbringer fire relic. So I have 5 points, for example, I'm going to lose 2.5 seconds. Now, some people may see this as a nerf. It's actually a good thing. I have complained in the past about the fact that we are too reliant upon doing good damage during Crusade. Anyone who has done Tomb of Sargeras knows in particular that unless you're a DPS whore and you are actually doing mechanics properly, there are frequently times when you have to stop DPS when Crusade is up. Usually to move and go and deal with a mechanic away from the boss. So there's nothing you can actually hit, really, apart from firing judgments, and if you happen to have any holy power there, the odd divine storm, and hope that it's more than enough distance. But it's actually a good thing that they're doing this, because they are compensating us by buffing other abilities across the board. They did say this during the Reddit AMA, which took place some time ago now. They said what they would like to do is to somehow nerf Crusade and then significantly buff the rest of our abilities to compensate, and this is what they've done. So all damage abilities are increased by 6%. So it's just a 6% straight up increase. Now the end result of this, you'd think says, oh, so what have I been buffed overall? Because I've got a buff here and I've got a bit of a nerf. Some figures coming out are around about 4%. As we'll see in a moment, it's for me 3.3%, which is not that far off. It should be a buff for everyone. Everyone, no matter what sort of gear and relics and stuff you've got, it should be a buff. However, if you are currently using legendaries, as indeed I am, for single target, that benefit from Crusade, that is Chain of Thrain and Liadrian's Fury Unleashed, obviously the effects of those 2 legendaries is going to be diminished. That doesn't mean to say that they're not going to be the best choices for you. In fact, when I've been going through some sims, for single target bosses at any rate, which is basically every boss in Tomb of Sargeras on Mythic mode, I'm still going to be using those 2 legendaries. So, although the effects of them has been nerfed a little bit, they can still be your best, but I'll go over that in a moment. Similarly, if you have several relics which buff Wrath of the Ashbringer, then the effects of those is going to be reduced. You might want to reconsider. It may be, for example, that you have a relic that is 10 item levels higher than your Wrath relic, which at the moment you don't want to replace, but maybe you will after this. So you want to resim it. The way it's actually looking at the moment is Tomb of Sargeras is quite good for relics now, because our fire relic, there's a Wrath of the Ashbringer relic that drops off Demonic Inquisition. I would still definitely go for that. It's still the best trait for single target. No argument about that. Just not by miles anymore. So if you get a significantly higher item level fire relic somewhere else, then of course you slot that. But Sisters of the Moon, which drops a relic that it buffs Blade of Justice for the Holy slot, which is what I've got. I've got 2 940 Holy Relics from Sisters. They are now looking much better as well. So I sort of gain a little bit here because I've already got 2 of those relics at a very good item level. If you are currently wielding 3 relics with Wrath of the Ashbringer, you might want to consider if other ones are better. And remember what I always say as a patch is coming, you should already have been doing this. If you get any high item level pieces, even if they're not an upgrade, you hold on to them because you never know when they will be. Coming back to Chain of Thrain, the second point down says Chain of Thrain now correctly additively stacks with Crusade. That again will makes more sense in terms of the way it does its damage. It would be a slight nerf on that. But again, the Chain of Thrain is still likely to be the legendary to go for. Not only is it still a strong legendary on its own, but you have to bear in mind, at the moment, if you're a raider, it's quite likely, by no means certain at the moment because it's getting close, but it's quite likely you have 2-piece tier 19 and 4-piece tier 20. If you are in that position, then other legendaries which potentially could be better would include something like Whispers of the Nathrazim, the cloak. Well, that's taken up a tier slot. That breaks up your set bonus. Now, I've done some sims on myself with that and found that it is not a DPS increase for me to break that 2 set, even with a really good non-tier piece taking the place of the other tier 19 piece. So I am still going to stick with Chain of Thrain and Liadrian's Fury Unleashed, but you should sim for the legendaries that you have and the gear you have to see if there might be a better legendary for you in that case. Now, Mastery was the big thing that needed dealing with. Second, the assumption with the way gearing works in Legion is that secondary stats are all very close in value. For the vast majority of classes and specs, this is very, very far from the truth. For Retribution Paladins, it has actually been pretty good in Legion. The secondary stats, and indeed our primary stat of strength, has tended to be fairly close in value. If one slips behind, it increases in value, and then if you keep them in a reasonable balance, they're all worth round about the same. The one big blot on the landscape has been Mastery. Mastery has lagged significantly behind to the point where we don't really want Mastery. When we get an item with Mastery on it, we are disappointed. It's entirely possible that even if it's a significant item level upgrade, that it will not be an upgrade overall. However, Mastery is being buffed, which is exactly what we needed. This means that not only will your Judgment do more damage, but so will your spenders as long as they are hitting a target with the Judgment debuff. So Templar's Verdict in particular is going to now do more damage as a result of this, along with Execution Sentence. Also Divine Storm as long as you've managed to spread your judgments to all the targets. The end result of this is that Mastery gear is no longer as toxic as it once was. So if you've been holding on to any high item level Mastery pieces of gear, it might be worth simming them. With the 7.3 sim, you can sim with the PTR mode enabled now, by the way, on Simcraft. And of course, when 7.3 goes live, as long as you're using the latest version of Simcraft, you should be able to find out as well. But simming some of these pieces of gear might mean maybe you actually want to equip a piece of Mastery gear. Don't get the impression it's suddenly screaming to the top of our priorities, but it's back in the fold, it's back in the mix. We're all good friends with Mastery now. Next one, speaking of Execution Sentence again, the damage of that has been increased by 17%, so it's been increased beyond the general buff for our abilities. This may mean that in a single target situation you want to use Execution Sentence. I am going to caution on that one though, but I am going to look at that in a bit more detail towards the end of this video. Righteous Blade trait bonus reduced to 4% per rank, which was 5% per rank. This is the trait which buffs your Divine Storm. As such, it is not a relic that you have generally wanted to have used. The downside of this is more to do with the fact that it is a relative nerf to Divine Storm. Divine Storm, remember, like all other abilities, has been buffed by 6%. But all our abilities have been buffed by 6%, but the fact that a trait that affects Divine Storm has been nerfed means that the net increase in Divine Storm is less than other abilities. So you could argue in an AoE situation from that point of view a little bit of a nerf, but do remember the buff to Mastery, which may help compensate that. Now, the Righteous Blade trait is not on relics that you'd wanted to have slotted anyway, because you only use Divine Storm in a cleave or AoE situation, and if you're on a boss, especially a single target boss, you're not going to be using any Divine Storms. And because relics are not the sort of things you can switch in and out like talents, unless it was a very, very high item level, you were unlikely to have equipped any of these relics. So it shouldn't be a big deal. We're just losing the 4% from the traits that we naturally have on our Rashbringer. The final point on the patch notes is Unbreakable Will, which is the ability that breaks us out of stuns, is no longer triggered when you're under the effect of Sleep Canister. This is a bit of a googly that's bold here, just to confuse people. Sleep Canister is an ability on a boss in Antorus the Burning Throne, which is the Argus raid, which isn't even coming out for a while. So quite why are they putting that in the patch notes, I do not know, because from our point of view, Sleep Canister is not even in the game yet. So ignore that completely. Don't even worry about that. So when it comes to sims, so I was simming myself a little bit on the PTR. For me, as I said before, if I use the same talents and the same gear that I'd normally use for a boss in Tomb of Sargeras, I am getting a 3.3% increase in DPS for me personally. That is significant. That's okay. I'm not going to complain about that. Some people are finding a bit more. Some people will inevitably find a bit less. All depends on what your exact gear is and what talents you're taking, what trinkets you're taking, everything like that. So what I did is I also had a little look at my stat weights, and sure enough, mastery coming back up to the fold, and I was thinking, oh, okay. But it still wasn't the best by any means. I mean, this is the other thing to note. You know, it's still not going to be one, oh, mastery, fantastic. You know, you're still allowed to be disappointed when it's got mastery on it. It's just no longer, oh, well, that's clearly trash then. You sim it, maybe it's not. Especially if you've got quite low mastery. If you've got low mastery, then actually the value could come up to the point where maybe you want a little bit more. So I tried changing around some bits of gear because I do carry a bag full of high item level stuff that has stats on it which, you know, aren't simming all that great live currently. Before 7.3 comes out. I didn't in actual fact find a different set of gear that sims higher for me. So I'm still likely to be taking the same set of gear for those Tomb of Sargeras bosses. Maybe changes a little bit for the AoE bosses, but it's worth doing this yourself as well. So try a few different sets of gear, see what happens. Now, final bit is coming on to those dead talents. There are a couple of talents where when you look at the patch notes, you start to think to yourself, maybe there's a use for them. And those two talents are Execution Sentence and Greater Judgment. So Execution Sentence, of course, is an ability that is pure single target. You would never take this unless it was just a pure single target fight. So a raid boss, Tomb of Sargeras, that sort of thing. I'd already produced a video on using Execution Sentence some time ago because this is not the first time they have tried to buff it to make it look more appealing during Legion. So I'll put a link in a card in the top corner there. Now, when I simmed myself, it came out at a 2.2% increase over Final Verdict. So straight away you're thinking, okay, so we should use Execution Sentence. Just be very, very careful here. There are dangers with Execution Sentence, which I discussed in that video, but just to make you clear now, if you don't want to watch that one, you have to make sure these sims will assume you are using Execution Sentence properly. And sometimes things are out of your control. You have to make sure that the Execution Sentence drops during the judgment window. It is most unlike any other spender. With any other spender, we make sure that the judgment debuff is on the target when we spend. Not so with Execution Sentence. That's not to say it mustn't be on the target, but it must be on the target when it lands, not when we use it. So there are situations with Execution Sentence where it's perfectly fine. In fact, you could argue preferable to use Execution Sentence before judgment because that has guarantees that it will land during that window. Judgment has an 8-second window. Execution Sentence, the rate at which it falls and the cooldown is affected by haste. In my case, it takes 5.5 seconds to fall. So generally speaking, you should be okay. But let's say I use Judgment and then I use a couple of other abilities and then I use Execution Sentence. With those two global cooldowns, there is quite a high chance that the Execution Sentence will slip between the cracks of my applications of Judgment. Now, if that happens like once in a fight, oh, it's no big deal, is it? But if it happens quite a few times, that's a problem. So you do need to be very careful. You do need to make sure you're tracking the Judgment debuff and your Execution Sentence to get the best use out of it. That being said, there are certain advantages in Execution Sentence because it can be used at ranged. If you're constantly having to move out of range, say on Mistress Sassine, and you've got your Holy Power to spend, well, it means you don't have to just fire an aimless Divine Storm there or do nothing at all if you might kill ads too early. What you can do instead is fire off your Execution Sentence. Your Judgment is also at range, so you can also manage those two things. And if you're only moving out of range for a few seconds and back in, then Execution Sentence might be useful in that situation. But do remember that by losing Final Verdict, you are going to reduce the damage on your Templar's Verdict. You're going to reduce the damage on your Divine Storm. So if there's any cleaving to be done or anything like that, then it may not be the best one for you. So you'll have to judge that one yourself. Just bear in mind that the DPS increase it says on a sim may not be the DPS increase you get. You may not get a DPS increase at all if you do not use this ability correctly. Now, Greater Judgment looks straight away like an AoE talent, and of course it's better for AoE, but it does have single target use as well with the guaranteed crits on Judgment above 50%. It's a reverse execute for us. So I simmed it with single target talents and gear, and actually it did not look like a DPS increase at all. But you know what? It wasn't far behind. Now bear this in mind for when the raid comes out, the Argus raid, because one of our set bonuses currently has a massive buff to Judgment. If that remains as it is, and that's a big if, then Greater Judgment could well be a single target talent by the time Antorus the Burning Throne comes out. But in the here and now, even in 7.3, okay, no, it's not looking like we're going to use it for single target. But then I simmed it for Hectic Adcleave, thinking of myself, obviously not Tuma Sargeras, not suitable for any of those bosses, but for, say, Mythic Plus Dungeons, especially on Fortified. But Mythic Plus Dungeons, plenty of trash. The trash takes you longer than the bosses generally. As long as you've got the measure of the bosses, you're generally okay. So definitely on a Fortified week, or a teaming week, or especially both. Would I want to use Greater Judgment? So with Hectic Adcleave, the answer is a resounding yes, you would. So this does only slightly less single target damage. So when I do get to bosses in a Mythic Plus dungeon, I'm not losing very much by using Greater Judgment. It's negligible. It's less than 1%. But I am gaining a significant amount by using it for trash packs. So Greater Judgment you can consider to be a useful AoE talent in 7.3. But again, you should sim it for yourself. All my sims are based on my character with my choice of gear. Yours may be different. So hopefully that brings you up to speed with the changes for 7.3. If you've got any further questions, ask them down below. As soon as 7.3 goes out, I will be scheduling a date for my next live Retribution Paladin Q&A. That will be sometime in September, early September. If you did find the video useful, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.